right, perfect. I think we're going to get started. It's 11:02, so we've let some people in, but there might be more people coming. So thank you all for attending today to come support my research project. First, before we get started, I would like to give a big thank you to the UofL Center for Engaged Learning for fully funding this research project, and also to Dr. Elizabeth Patton, who's been my mentor throughout this project. She actually works as a professor of applied linguistics and teaching English as a foreign language in the College of Education and Human Development. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Cody Smith, and I'm a bachelor's student and undergraduate here at the University of Louisville. Hello, studying French education, and here's one of my dear French professors. And I also have studied Latin and Spanish, which I'm a minor in. And so it all began when I was around 15. I actually studied Latin for the first time and made a huge passion for language. And things really got started when I taught myself French and really became interested in the processes of second language acquisition. And now that I've sort of become a teacher and sort of gone into some teaching roles, I teach French courses in the community at the Alliance Française de Louisville. Now that I've sort of become a French teacher, I'm really interested in second language pedagogy and how we teach languages, the best practices, methods, the history of methods, things like that. And so this summer, I've been participating in the Summer Research Opportunity Program, which is an opportunity for undergraduates to engage in independent research with the help of a mentor. And so you really get to dive in head first in independent research and really experience what it's like to do this kind of thing on your own. The project that I chose to do this summer was a systematic review of secondary, and what I mean by secondary is 14 to 18-year-olds, because as you go from country to country, the word secondary can mean a number of things, right? So I ended up having to give an age parameter class of 14 to 18-year-olds. What I ended up doing was a systematic review of secondary learners' attitudes toward language learning. Perfect.
Якщо має питання, можна спробувати якісь паттерни, але я куплю нові ресурси.
Я потім оце, я вже нині зробила на кухні, а потім буду щось робити, ти на світі стоїть, знаєш?
There we go. Perfect. Okay. Alrighty. So I believe today's presentation will take about 30 minutes of your time. We're going to begin with a sort of overview of language attitudes research and the systematic review methodology. We have a number of research librarians in the house, so I wanted to sort of cater this to you all. I'm hearing that you're really getting to know these systematic reviews more often and to help students and researchers with these. So I wanted to give you all a bit of information that you can take away with you. But for us linguists, for us people interested and passionate about language teaching, I really wanted to delve into that research and give you a little bit of background about that. After that, I'll spend about 20 minutes talking about my approach, how I went about the systematic review. And if you were to go out and read a systematic review right after the session, I wouldn't say that my approach differed too differently from systematic reviews in the field, but there were some key differences that I would like to talk about. I'll also mention my findings and what this means for the language learner, their attitudes, the factors influencing those attitudes, as well as how we can take this information as teachers and really translate that into our teaching to improve and teach in a way that is conducive to learners' positive attitudes. Okay? And then we'll end with a questions and answer session where I'll pass the mic to you all. You all will process the information and really ask some questions about the methodology and the research project itself. So first, I'm going to give a little bit of background to language learner attitudes. So the first thing we have to mention, as we know, when we're beginning to study a variable, right, we want to conceptualize it. Oftentimes, we need to begin with a definition, right? The issue with language attitudes and defining language attitudes is it depends who you ask, right? There's a lot of definitions for language attitudes. This reminds me of a psycholinguistics and sociolinguistics course I took my freshman year, where we were asked to define the word language. That took about 15 minutes for my group to do, and we still couldn't come up with an all-inclusive definition. And in research, it's the same way regarding language learner attitudes. It depends on who you ask. So Colin Baker, for instance, who is a key researcher in language attitudes, said that it is a hypothetical construct influencing the direction and persistence of human behavior. That's one. But other researchers have proposed, for example, Anita Winden says that attitudes, we can really break it down into three components. We can break it down into cognitive components, so what we think about something, in this case language, affective, so what we feel about something, our likes and dislikes, so what we feel about language, and then we can also break it down into a behavioral component. But I really like the definition of Robert Gardner, who's really been a pioneer in a lot of this language attitudes research. He's a Canadian researcher at Western University, Ontario, who said that attitudes are an evaluative reaction to some referent or attitude object, inferred on the basis of an individual's opinions or beliefs about the referent. So essentially, in my own words, what this means is attitudes really are a conglomeration of all of our beliefs, our ambitions, our fears, our anxieties regarding an object, and that really informs our reaction to that thing. And so I really looked at, all of these definitions when I was going into this research. All right, but regardless of the definition that you take to language attitudes, what we do know about it is that it definitely does influence the second language learning process, right? So, one researcher, or actually two researchers, Lightbound and Spada, who wrote a seminal text on second language acquisition, said that attitudes can actually influence the persistence of students in studying the language. So if they have positive attitudes, they'll continue to study the language. If they have negative attitudes, they may quit studying the language after a short time. And so with this sort of importance of research and seeing that there is sort of a relationship between achievement and attitudes, this has become more popular in recent years. So there's really been a rise in research on language attitudes since the 1970s and 1980s. And there's been a number of constructs created to allow us to tap in to language attitudes, to look at learner attitudes. And some of these instruments include the Attitudes and Motivation Test Battery, which was created by Gardner himself. So this is one instrument researchers have used to tap into language attitudes. So this is a sort of survey where they get to choose from not satisfied to very satisfied regarding a question. So I think my teacher teaches English well. I'm good paraphrasing here. Other constructs which have been created to tap into language attitudes include the beliefs about language learning inventory, created by Horwitz, which allows us to look into the beliefs of language learners regarding the language learning process. The Foreign Language Attitude Scale was another one, and also a lot of researchers have created their own Likert scale surveys to look at language attitudes. So when you read these studies, a lot of researchers will either be adapting some of these instruments to tap into language attitudes and look at language attitudes, or they'll create their own Likert scale survey, like a 1 to 5 scale, to really look at language attitudes. Okay? All right, so now to get into a little bit of the systematic review methodology, which I think will be interesting for the research librarians in the house. So the first thing that you need to know is that these reviews are actually very common in the healthcare sector, because these are a way of taking a lot of research, the results of a lot of research, and putting them together to make informed decisions, right? So doctors oftentimes, when they're thinking about giving a certain intervention, let's say a medicine, a procedure to a patient, they'll want to look at all of the studies that have been conducted on that topic and essentially put those together in a way that allows them to effectively make a decision. However, these are becoming more common in other fields like education. I read one from Purdue University regarding outcomes, student learning outcomes in engineering programs in the K through 12. And so these are becoming popular in other fields as well. If you were to go out and read a scientific article right after this session, this is going to differ a little bit from your traditional literature review, right? Your traditional narrative literature review. And it does this in several ways. So one way that this is different is that typically with systematic reviews, there are more than one author, okay? Because one of the things we're hoping to achieve with systematic reviews is to lessen the bias, right? We want less bias, especially in the healthcare field where we're trying to make important decisions. We're trying to eliminate bias as much as possible. So when we're including articles to include in this review, we're not making the decision to include an article based on our own beliefs, our own ideas, our own sort of data, or the argument we're making, but rather on external criteria, and we do this with a team, right? So if we have one researcher saying, I want to include this article, and another researcher saying, I don't want to include this article, we're going to put them in a conversation together to solve that conflict, right? So typically, for inter-reviewer reliability, there's more than one author. That's one way that systematic reviews are different from traditional narrative reviews that you'll read in scientific articles. Okay, so another way that they differ is that they report search strings and databases. So typically, if you read sort of the methods section of a systematic review paper, the author will be reporting the databases that they searched, as well as the search strings that they used, and often the date that they did the search. And this is to make the study replicable, to make it real science, right? Because really, we want to make sure that all of these results are valid. And one way of doing this is knowing exactly how the search was performed. Whereas with the traditional literature review, you wouldn't necessarily have that. Another way that this differs is that there's inclusion and exclusion criteria. So like I was saying earlier, we're not including articles based on the fact that we like them, based on the fact that they're supporting our viewpoints. We're including them based on inclusion and exclusion criteria. And this is notably to eliminate bias. So these are set beforehand, before the study even begins. And we're really using this to, again, eliminate bias. With systematic reviews, there's sort of a three-step process. So the first step would be deduplication. So taking all the articles we found across the databases, all of the results, and deduplicating them, eliminating the ones that are the same. Then we'll do a title and abstract screening. So we'll look at the title and abstract of all of the articles that weren't the same, so after the deduplication, and see how those fit our inclusion and exclusion criteria. After that, we'll take those articles and we'll look and do a full text screening. We'll look at the methods, the participants, how the study was conducted, how the data was retrieved. We'll do a full text screening to make sure one more time this fits our inclusion, exclusion criteria. So this goes through multiple screening processes. And that's how this differs from a traditional literature review. But there's more. We also use technology with these systematic reviews. So typically, you'll use software platforms, rather, typically like Covidence. So Covidence allows you to sort of go about that screening process. And this is often used in the healthcare field. We have a subscription to that here at UofL, but it's through the UofL Library. I ended up using Ryan, which does something very, very similar, sort of walking you through that screening process in a systematic, methodological way. All right. Typically, we're also going to be looking at grade literature, right? So we're going to be including theses. We're going to be including conference proceedings. We're going to be including dissertations within the systematic review. We're trying to get all of the data that exists in the field to support our research questions, right? And this may not be the case in literature reviews, though it might be. Additionally, we're going to be using data extraction tools to go through and really pick out the data that's supporting our research question. So I created my own data extraction tool, and I believe that that's what the majority of researchers who do these systematic reviews do. And so that is one thing that we do a little bit differently with systematic reviews. Another thing is that the data often undergoes assessments with this sort of checklist. We want to make sure that the data is reliable as possible. So oftentimes, researchers will take the data that they got with their data extraction tool out of these articles that they chose. And they'll use this data assessment form to make sure that it is valid, that it is reliable. A lot of researchers will use Conquering Risk of Bias tool. However, this tool is, again, a little bit more healthcare oriented. I have an example with me today, which is the Critical Appraisal Skills Program. I'll pass this around so you can get a sense of how data assessment is done within the field. So you can really look at how you can take the data, take the articles that you're reading, and make sure that the data is reliable, that you're getting good data, right? Additionally, we use the preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analysis guidelines. This association has created guidelines, reporting guidelines, to make sure that when we're reporting these systematic reviews, writing the systematic review article, we're being as clear as possible about how we went about the collection process, making sure we're eliminating bias. They also created a sort of flow chart, which summarizes the process, and we're going to see that here in a moment. Additionally, systematic reviewers will register their review on Prospero. Typically, we don't want to repeat these reviews. They're timely. And although there are reasons to repeat a systematic review, to replicate it, to answer different research questions, perhaps, typically we don't want to do the same one twice. And if one's already being done, we typically don't want to do this. I do not register mine on Prospero just because it is sort of a summer research project for me to get acquainted with research. And typically, these will culminate in a statistical meta-analysis. So we'll take the effect sizes, the data from all of these articles, and put them together quantitatively, statistically. Now, sometimes you can also do more qualitative systematic reviews, which is what I did because my study was more on the qualitative side. We're going to see it in just a moment. And I sort of used a narrative synthesis Also, I analyzed my data a little bit thematically to look at the data, to look at the different categories, and put it all together in a sort of narrative way. All right, so to talk a little bit about how I went about collecting this data, the first step when you're doing a systematic review is really to create solid research questions. And the way that a lot of researchers doing systematic reviews will go about this, especially in the healthcare field, is using the PEAK-GO format. So population, intervention, comparison, and outcome. However, I ended up using the SPIDER format, which is more along the lines of qualitative research. So looking at sample, phenomenon of interest, design, evaluation, and research type. Obviously, my design was a systematic review, and the research type was qualitative. So you won't see these within the research questions, but the questions themselves were, according to the academic literature of the last 25 years, so I set this range of articles that I want to look at. I want to look at the last 25 years, 1999 to 2024. Are students' attitudes toward language learning primarily positive or negative? That's question one. But as important as that is, I think it's even more important to think about the factors that are influencing these positive and negative attitudes. Right? I wanted to know the why. What are the factors behind these attitudes? And the third question was, what are the pedagogical implications of this for teachers? How can we take this knowledge about students' attitudes, about the factors influencing them, and use that within our teaching to sort of help improve learners' attitudes in a way? And by the way, secondary, as I mentioned earlier, to people coming in, I sort of define that as 14 to 18, because as you're looking at different countries, the word secondary can differ a little bit. And so I ended up setting that age parameter to really give me a nice view of what secondary means. Alright, so I went about creating first my inclusion-exclusion criteria. So I focused on studying the date range, so 1999 to 2024, the last 25 years. I included studies that had empirical data. I didn't want things like narrative literature reviews entering the mix. I really wanted some rich data, quantitative mix, and qualitative studies. I included studies published in English, as well as, and only studies included in English. Typically, that is a inclusion criteria used by systematic reviewers for some reason. Although I could have said French and Latin, given my background, but I don't know, I would have found many articles written in Latin. Additionally, I used a lot of great literature, quite a bit anyways, so including those theses, conference proceedings, etc. I focused primarily on peer-reviewed articles and only excluding great literature, if great literature entered the mix and it was within these categories, it was okay. Additionally, I wanted studies focusing on secondary age learners and not like elementary students or university students or things like that. So really taking these inclusion-exclusion criteria, I went to 4 different databases. I went to Linguistics and Language Behavior Abstracts, ERIC, Google Scholar, which I know mixed feelings, APA PsycInfo as well, and I created search strings for each of these databases. Search strings that fit the syntax of each database. With the help of Lydia Broke, who's with us here on Teams, so hello to her, thank you. And this is sort of how I went about this process. To retrieve my citations from Google Scholar, I actually ended up using a software called Publish or Perish from a researcher called Harzing. And what I found, because this really facilitates the process of exporting citations from Google Scholar, because when you go to Google Scholar, exporting one by one, that's a little difficult. So I use this software to do that, but unfortunately, with Google Scholar and Publish or Perish, you can only get 999 results. So that is one limitation of the study. However, I still think it provided a good, rich amount of data to go about this process. Alrighty. So I essentially took the results of all of those databases, I put them together, and I uploaded them into Ryan. And it was here that I was able to sort of walk through that screening process. Deduplication, title and abstract screening, full text screening. So I sort of did that here. So review data, deduplication, screening, that would be the initial screening, and then full text screening, the final one. And as you can see, this is sort of how it works. You can see some of the articles that I included, like the UofL students' attitudes toward learning English language, the case of William secondary students. It sounds pretty in line with my inclusion-exclusion criteria, right? So to really summarize this process and how I went about it, from the 4 databases, I had 2,137 searches. I put those into Ryan, I deduplicated them. I ended up deduplicating 170, which gave me 1,967 articles, which I then screened initially with Python abstract, excluding because they weren't like in line with what I was studying. They were, not fitting my criteria. I excluded 1,796, which left me 171 to go through the full text of. So I went through the full text of these 171 articles, and then I ended up excluding 86 because they had the wrong population, focusing on elementary or university learners. They had the wrong outcomes, so maybe like analyzing the relationship of attitudes and other variables, so not very fit with my study. Wrong publication types, so maybe like a literature review that's just like no data at all, just talking about it. Or pre-1999. I think there was one study that was pre-1999 that was republished in like 2014, but I decided to exclude it because it was pre-1999. And that left me with 85 studies to look at the data of. And so what I ended up doing was creating a data collection form, data extraction form, which sort of was divided into two parts. Bibliographical information, so focusing on the authors, study design, the journal, and then I had study-specific information, where I was interested in what the context of the study was, so the number of students, the country in which the learning is happening, the factors playing a role in the attitudes, if these attitudes are positive or negative. And if you would like to look at the entire data extraction form for all 85 articles, I have a QR code right here that you'll have to scan and look at. And if you want, I can send this to you all later. There will be a form at the end to fill out, and you all can take a look at this. But first, I'd like to tell you a little bit about my results. So my first question was, are the attitudes of students primarily positive or negative? To my surprise, attitudes were primarily positive. 47 articles reported positive attitudes. More than half of the articles, 55% to be exact, reported positive attitudes. And while you're not supposed to create a hypothesis when doing these systematic reviews, I obviously had my own thoughts and beliefs and biases inside that are trying to keep away. And I was really surprised at this because as you look at the enrollment of languages, other than Spanish typically, we're going to see a decline. So I thought this might be because students have negative attitudes towards language learning, but actually, across the globe, it seems like, and of course these were students in multiple language classes, but I was really surprised to see that attitudes were positive primarily. Only 15 articles reported negative attitudes. And there were 9 that reported mixed and indifferent. I think that speaks for itself, but 14 articles reported unspecified attitudes, and this was because the article is about like beliefs toward language learning, so not necessarily talking about attitudes in a way. And so I included those under unspecified, which is sort of its own category. Okay. But even more important than understanding that attitudes are primarily positive are the factors playing a role within those. So here I'm going to answer research questions 2 and 3, where I talk about primarily sort of the factors playing a role in attitudes, as well as what we can do as teachers. And I'm going to give you an example. I have 6 categories, okay? What I ended up doing was looking at my data extraction form. I created some categories that I could fit these factors under. I did this initially with ideas that I had while I was going through the data extraction process, and then I went back to the data extraction form and really created some new categories as I was going along. I was able to fit all the factors under 6 categories. So I'll give you one example of a factor from each of the 6 categories and one way that I'm going to use this as a teacher. So the first category was demographic factors. This is things like background, the students, where they come from, their nationality perhaps. One of the interesting things I found from this study was that gender was at least an influencing factor in language attitudes. So females, on the whole, had more positive attitudes toward foreign language learning than their male counterparts, which I found super interesting. I believe it's Yoko Kobayashi, I believe is the name of the researcher, in 2002 said in their article that this is because in Japan, the occupations being taken up by females require English language proficiency, whereas those taken up by males don't necessarily require English language proficiency. So it's this utility factor that's really playing a role. Also, another article that I read from Libya said that the activities we do in our classrooms, so like reading, that may be more favored by females, whereas kinesthetic movement activities, that may be more favored by males. And so I found this kind of interesting that females had more positive attitudes than males. But how do I use this in my classroom? One of the things that I hope to do is do a variety of activities that are interesting to a number of demographics. I hope to use movement activities as much as reading activities, but I also hope to give them texts that are interesting to all sort of genders, all demographics. Using texts that are culturally responsive, where students can see themselves in the text we're listening, the text we're reading to it in French, for example. Additionally, and this is the category that gets me going, I absolutely love instruction and teaching language. And so one of the categories I found was instructional factors. So negative attitudes emerged when traditional pedagogies were being used. So things like grammar translation, memorizing paradigms, memorizing vocab lists. Whereas if more modern pedagogy, where students got to use the language that's being used in a communicative way, so task-based language teaching, where we give students real-world tasks in which they can use the target language, I found that students had more positive attitudes towards this. They really wanted opportunities to use their language in context. And so there was actually one article from England that I read where students studying for the GCSE got to go to a hotel and learn how to work in a hotel in French. And I thought that was very interesting. They had very positive attitudes. So one of the ways that I hope to take this information in my classroom is not focusing on sort of language as a study of grammar rules, vocabulary, but rather engaging my learners in real-world tasks where they can use the target language, where they can really become users of the target language, function in the language. One of the ideas I have is incorporating a model that I created in my psycholinguistics and sociolinguistics class freshman year, which I created based on synthesis of research in the field. So I took authors that are pretty prominent in second language acquisition, like Stephen Grafton, Meryl Swain, Bill Van Patton, and put them into a sort of hybrid. I put their perspectives together and synthesized them. And if I take this model and apply it to the classroom, I sort of created this as an explanation for how learning occurs. But if I take this and put it in the classroom, language isn't built from the bottom up. It's not built from memorizing vocabulary and grammar and then building that up, but rather reading text, reading, using language in context, hearing language, so comprehensible input, hearing language, reading language in context, processing it through structured input activities, and then noticing the forms and sort of linking the form, the morphological or syntactic forms, with meaning, and then using those in meaningful output activities, in real-world output activities. So writing and speaking, which hopefully will make the language more automatic. So I hope to take this model and apply it to my classroom and look and see if this has an effect sort of on my learners' proficiency. And I really want to focus on the building of language as a skill and not sort of as making my students theoretical linguists. Moving on, there are 4 more categories, and then we'll get to a Q&A section. So the next category was personality and personal belief factors. So I found that anxiety was a big factor that played a role in negative attitudes within language classes. And I found this very interesting. I thought it was intriguing, in fact. And one of the things I need to do is find a way to lower students' anxiety in my classroom, lower that affective filter, if you're familiar with practice work. And so one of the ways that I hope to do this, I have a couple of ideas. First one is not correcting every mistake that a learner makes. That's oftentimes what we get in language classes, and that can be very demotivating, as we see in SLA literature. However, anxiety also, I also want to do something that was mentioned in my education program where I create a safe space for students. So when they're feeling anxiety, when they're feeling overwhelmed, they can sort of go back to the back of the classroom, do some breathing exercises, some things, remove themselves from the learning just for a moment, calm down, de-escalate, and then come back to the learning a little bit refreshed. That was one idea that I had about lowering anxiety. Additionally, extrinsic factors, so test results, teacher approval, these played a role in attitude. So if the teacher approved of the student, then maybe their attitudes would be raised. So one of the ways that I hope to use this in my classroom is by focusing on growth rather than mistakes, focusing on the message that students are conveying in the target language rather than their mistakes. So one of the ways I may do this is by allowing students to create a portfolio in the target language and look at the growth from the first unit of the first year and the growth made until the last unit of the first year, and showing that to students to show them how far they've come, to focus on that proficiency, to focus on that growth. And I think that that could be a very motivating factor, but also help work in a way that's conducive to those positive attitudes. Additionally, sociocultural factors. this was very interesting. So parents' attitudes actually had an influence on their children's attitudes as well towards the target language. And one of the ideas I've had for a while is doing an outreach event at my school where I work after graduation. I'll be graduating this fall. And one of the ideas that I had is sort of having an outreach night, like a night of language where students get to share sort of the achievement that they've gotten in the target language, and also to show parents how language education is being done in the 21st century, as if we look at the history of language teaching methods, it may differ from the time that they took a language in school. Additionally, I'm interested in these contextual and situational factors, so where the learning took place. What I found was that in urban settings, students had more positive attitudes than their peers in rural settings. And this might be because in rural settings, there may be fewer resources than there are in urban settings. So one of the things I have to do is provide my students with as many resources as possible, especially technology. Students really enjoy and appreciate the use of technology in the classroom. So wherever I end up teaching, whether that be urban or rural, I have to give my students as many resources to succeed as possible, and to give them additionally access to technology to facilitate the second language acquisition process. I also give them opportunities to interact with native speakers via sort of video conference calls and the like. Students appreciate that as well. Alrighty, so that was a little bit of an introduction to my research, very quick, as I wanted to respect your time. We could talk about this for hours and look at all these factors for hours and really take this a long way. But I wanted to open up the floor now to talk a little bit about your questions and answer some questions. No questions from the group. Okay. Let's see. Do we have any questions on? Oh, perfect.
Yeah. So you mentioned the inter-rater reliability factor. Did that play into your approach at all, or was nature a summer research opportunity where you're not able to try that collaboration?
Exactly. I wasn't really able to have that collaborative component. That was one of the ways that my project differed from systematic reviews you might read. I did sometimes run things by Dr. Patton. We would have our weekly discussions. For example, there were some articles on demotivation, and I was like, is motivation really the same thing as an attitude? I know they're linked, and if we think about Gardner's socio-educational model, definitely attitudes are affecting motivation. But I really wanted Dr. Patton's approval on this, because I really felt like there were some things. And I didn't really have the inter-rater reliability. So that was one of the things that was just the scope of my research. In 10 weeks, I couldn't really hire a lot of other people to work on this project with me. And so that was one of the limitations. If I were to publish this, I would have to definitely make that very clear. Absolutely. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, I found it very interesting. I was interested in how you selected your population as secondary learners and then defined it by age, given different international contexts.
Right.
What that involves. That means that did I understand right, that in fact you were looking at learners of different target languages?
Yes.
Okay, and again, I'm guessing in the context, you've done a huge amount in 10 weeks. It's incredibly impressive. So I'm guessing you didn't have a chance to dig into this piece, but that it might be relevant to explore more as you move ahead with this. Did you have the opportunity to separate it into the target language being learned, attitudes toward learning English versus, in fact, what you're doing, foreign language teaching, attitudes toward learning French or anything else in the US context, or for that matter, potentially Britain.
Right.
And I'm thinking, for instance, of Timothy Reagan's work that would fit in your timeframe on the foreign language educator in society, and that's written within the challenges of American society, monolingual English toward the learning of other languages.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Did you separate it by attitudes toward target language and country?
Yeah. And so while I definitely had that within my data, like I had the country where the language was being learned, I had the language being learned. I didn't really look at that when I was doing my analysis, because that really wasn't within the scope of this project and the 3 research questions. However, Dr. Patton and I were talking a few weeks ago, and I said that this data could actually be used for several different uses. And one of those could be looking at attitudes towards different languages, maybe how the languages differ, the attitudes towards languages differ. Unfortunately, I did not get to explore that within this study because that was sort of outside of my research questions. However, that would be an important area for future research, and I would absolutely love to explore that. And that's one way that this data could really come in handy. If you've got it now, you can do a lot of different things with it, right? A lot of different articles, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, absolutely. Right, any other questions from this group here? All right, we're going to look and see if there's any questions on Teams. I know that we had a few people. Yes, we had 2 people. Let's see. Okay, we just had a great job, Cody. Any questions from the group? You can say them out loud or you can type them. I guess I'll stop sharing.
Technologists at the very impressive work. It's a lot to take on, even reading 85 articles.
It is a lot.
How did you like deal with are really practical strategies like how do you get through it?
You know, I try to at least spend a few hours a day working on it. I try to, focus more on working throughout the week than, just like 10 hours one day. Now that last week when I was preparing the poster, which we'll get to see on the way out, I was up to like 5 a.m. It was like training sessions at that point. But in general, I just try to sort of put it out over the week. And I think it took me a while to get started and really, get really ready with this research. Because you have to, first create your protocol. You've got to create your inclusion and exclusion criteria, the research questions, etc. It takes a while to get started. It took me about 3 to 4 weeks to even get started. And then I had to go to all the databases, and then I ended up with ProQuest having the issue of getting like 5,000 search results. So then I went to the research library and I was like, can you help? And they were like, select anywhere full text. And I was like, thank you. I got 900 very, focused articles on my research topic, and it was great. But it did take a while to get started. However, I'm glad I ended up choosing this research methodology. I don't think these questions could have been answered in a better way. I didn't know much about systematic reviews 10 weeks ago, so the frustration, the challenges were certainly there. It was something that I worked through. But I feel like I came out of the end of the project a better person. This project also allowed me to do a lot of the things I really wanted to do, like sign my first lease and do a lot of the things I really not want to do. And it's really clarify the next step in my professional career, which is going into teaching full-time. I actually don't want to pursue a PhD full-time right now. I really want to focus on teaching first before I dive into language teaching research. I feel like I need to develop a sort of profile as a language educator, practitioner, before moving into research. So I think that's important. Okay. This is some interesting, awesome job, especially given your time in the States. I also love hearing how you plan to apply your findings to teaching. I think that's important. I actually used the instructional factors a couple of weeks ago. I taught a 7 to 10-year-old course at the Alliance Française. And so within my course, I actually created a marketplace where students got to use like €20 to go around and buy food at the 2 markets in the classroom. That's very culturally relevant. If you go to France, the marketplace is a big deal. And so I actually took this, and the students absolutely loved it. One little boy said, I'm going to ask my mom to bring me back here so I can study French. It surprised him by bringing him to my classes and going around the house learning French words, and he absolutely loved it. And so these findings are already being applied to teaching and making a good impact. So I think that that's wonderful. All right. Well, I think there's no more questions. So on the way out, there's one more thing before you all leave. Actually, I'm going to share my screen again for you all. Let's see here. I would like. I'm not a technology person, if you all can see. That is why I went into language teaching, because I can't do technology. Well, except we have to do technology. So if you wouldn't mind scanning this QR code, giving me some feedback on this presentation, what I can do better next time. This is actually like my first, like I did a symposium a couple weeks ago, but this is really like my first opportunity to present in front of a focused group like you all. I would really love some feedback. If you want a copy of today's presentation, drop your email because these are anonymous forms. So if you give me a bad review, I won't like say hi to you in your office or anything. So that'd be good. And then if you have any questions about the study or need anything else, here's my email. I also work outside here in access and user services, so come up to the desk, I guess. I'll be there.
I want to add one question, but we've been working together a long time, Cody and I on this, and there were some false starts and things that he wanted to do, and I just want to say too that part of the whole research project, which I wanted to write about that too, because how much he learned in going down the wrong way, and both of us going in the wrong direction, and just everything that he's learned, and I've learned a lot through this. I did not know how to do this type of review, and so I feel like Cody could sit down and, as you can see, he could teach others how to use this type of review. And so he didn't just learn about the topic; he learned an important skill that he can use maybe as a teacher, but certainly as an academic, which I'm just going to call it. He's going to be an academic someday. I can't imagine he's going to stay too long in K through 12. We're lucky to have him, but really, he's just an exceptional scholar, an exceptional MDM.
That's really nice thing, Cody, about what you said about the PhD. Yeah, that can wait.
Oh, absolutely.
You can get your experience in K through 12, and will certainly be a stronger PhD candidate down the road because you will have your life teaching experiments.
Yeah, think about people here, master's students I've worked with, or PhD students I've worked with, and he's an undergrad.
I know.
You have to remind yourself he's an undergrad.
The interdisciplinary,
He's done so well.
pulling this methodology in from healthcare and applying it to applied linguistics.
Understanding too the role that research librarians play in all this too. I'd say I'm Cody listed. I have my areas of expertise. That'll bode well for you too when you do grad school.
Yeah,
Make friends with the librarians. They know a lot.
absolutely, yeah. No, I think definitely the next stage of my career, I really want to focus on, getting some experience teaching, having my own classrooms, in 3 to 5 years, building my network, presenting at conferences, hopefully, maybe doing some action research that I'm super passionate about now. That's going to be my next big thing. I found a couple of master's programs that really interest me, one at Middlebury in French and another in Master of Foreign Language Teaching at Michigan State online. So this will allow me to do my master's during the teaching sort of section of my life and then move on to a PhD eventually. But right now, I want to focus on really building that network and getting involved in the field, becoming sort of a voice in the field, and then going to graduate school, sort of having that foundational work done for me. And so that'll be great. Perfect. All right. Yes.
Thank you for sharing all of your knowledge on this. And again, I understand the constraints and the why you made the choices you did, but as we're adapting this systematic review from the healthcare field, how do you, as a foreign language educator, focusing on French, and again, there may not have been any studies in
Right.
but how did you about, and here we were working on eliminating bias, how did you feel about having to eliminate studies produced in languages other than English?
Oh,
Well, it's all of the French
Right.
research
right.
had
Exactly.
to be in the name of English is the language of science. And that, of course, sort of intersects with my earlier question.
Right. Yeah.
How did this personally strike you as a French teacher to,
Well, I definitely had articles where different languages were being focused on, so I definitely got to look at those different languages. So that was great. However, getting to exclude articles that may have been written in French for like a French-speaking audience, like maybe like the University of Belgium or French, something like that, or Switzerland. I think there's something to discover there. Maybe that's another limitation of the study is I didn't get to look at, other, studies that may have been published in other languages. Maybe applied linguistics research is maybe more published in foreign languages because that's sort of our field here. So that might be interesting to look at later. If I were to ever expand this study, that could be very good. And I imagine there's way more than 85 articles. I imagine even my inclusion and exclusion criteria limited the project to some extent. So it's possible.
Yeah, write it in.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah, no,
absolutely.
I mean, it's a legitimate decision to make because you're both bringing this methodology in and that interests part like very much.
Right, definitely.
But I was just thinking for you, going into French, it must have sort of rankled. And yet, indeed, already the 30 plus years ago when I was starting my own study of linguistics, applied linguistics in Switzerland, we were reading a lot of articles in English. And yes, so that in that university context, now, and this is probably a cultural difference between Switzerland and France.
Right.
But yeah, in terms of language bias and exclusion and so forth. But yeah.
Interesting. Another thing I forgot to mention is the databases I chose, like APA Info, Eric. I really hope to choose databases that made up the field of applied linguistics. And second language acquisition, which is interdisciplinary, psychology, education, linguistics, etc. That was another thing that brought that to mind.
Yeah, as well, and I loved your choice of databases there. Under the same heading, though, I did wonder about certainly MLA, Modern Language Association, is primarily literature and culture, but at the same time, they do have some language learning.
Yeah, that is true.
But again, one can't, this is just amazing, the scope of work you've done this summer.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you all. On the way out, I have, if you all want to look at it, the poster that I presented of this research. Last week, actually, I created and designed this poster and presented it downtown at the Health Sciences campus. So if you want to take a look at that on your way out, you're more than welcome to. Thank you all for attending on Teams. It was great to have you all. I hope you all enjoyed the presentation, and thanks for working with me. It's been a great experience and time. And I'm going to end the recording now. I'm just going to keep that for my own use.